Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce said when Katie Rodriguez asked about the medication discrepancies in room for 12. Not her job. Not her concern. Just a nurse, 3 months into Seattle General, still learning where they kept the extra for stands. He said it like she'd suggested performing open-heart surgery with a soup spoon. The fluorescent lights above the nurse's station hummed their monotonous song. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She made another notation on her clipboard. What Dr. Pierce didn't know was that the quiet woman standing in front of him had spent 847 days in Tikrit performing field thoracotomies with a combat knife while mortars screamed overhead. What he didn't see was the legend buried under Norfolk-issued scrubs. What happened next would force an entire hospital to reckon with the difference between looking and actually seeing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part hadn't even started. Katie arrived at Seattle General at 5:53 a.m., the way she arrived everywhere, early, unseen, already mentally walking the floor. The October rain hammered the parking lot like applause no one was giving. She moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already survived the worst the world had to offer. Her scrubs were navy blue, regulation, indistinguishable from everyone else's. Her name badge read K. Rodriguez, RN. No rank. No military designation. No indication that the hands pushing through the hospital's glass doors had held 19 soldiers together on the stretcher of a Chinook helicopter while it took fire over the Sanjin Valley. She'd learned to be invisible. The army had taught her that invisibility was survival. The hospital had taught her that invisibility was job security. The third floor smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, coffee from yesterday's pot, coffee no one had bothered to replace. She set her badge against the reader. The lock clicked open. The corridor stretched before her, empty except for the night shift nurse leaving through the far doors, someone Katie didn't recognize and who didn't recognize her either. Perfect. She moved to her locker, number 247, and opened it with the kind of deliberate calmness that came from years of muscle memory. Most nurses had family photos taped inside. Pictures of children at baseball games. Husbands with their arms around their wives. Normal things. Normal lives. Katie had one item, a folded flag, wrapped in plastic, the fabric so precisely creased it could cut skin. The flag from Sergeant James Martinez's casket. The flag that Major David Chen, then a captain, had placed in her hands at Arlington 2 years ago while saying nothing at all. Some things didn't need words. She pressed her palm against the plastic for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to feel the weight of it, short enough that no one would notice if they were watching. They weren't. They never were. Room for 12 was her first stop, the way it had been for 78 shifts in a row. Major Chen was sleeping, his post-surgical vitals stable, the incision along his sternum healing at the predictable rate that meant nothing had gone wrong yet. His chart sat on the nurse's station. She reviewed his medications with the meticulous attention that most nurses would call obsessive. But obsession was precision. Precision was the difference between soldiers living and soldiers dying. The post-op medication record showed an issue or a small one, the kind most people would miss. Morphine dosing at 2,300 hours. 5 milligrams. Then nothing documented until 0300. But the discharge order from Dr. Pierce indicated a standing protocol of pain management every 4 hours. 5 milligrams at 2,300. The next dose should have been recorded at 0300. At 0700. At 1,100. But there was nothing. No documentation. No pharmacy signature. No administration record. Just an empty space where care was supposed to exist. She made a note in her personal nursing log, the one she kept separate from the official chart. Discrepancy in post-op medications, room for 12, Dr. Pierce attending. Date, October 18th, time noted, 0549. She didn't mention it to anyone. Not yet. Not until she understood what she was looking at. People in hospitals kept secrets. Hospitals kept bigger ones. By 7:15 a.m., the floor had filled with the controlled chaos of shift change. Nurses arriving. Nurses leaving. Doctors making rounds. Residents trailing behind them like pilot fish following a shark. Dr. Marcus Pierce stood at the center of everything, his white coat pristine, his stethoscope draped around his neck like he'd just performed a miracle instead of sleeping through the night in the call room. He was tall in the way wealthy men are tall, not because of height but because of posture, because of the assumption that the world would make space for him. Katie watched him from the corner of her vision as he moved through room 412, never asking questions, never asking Major Chen how the pain felt or whether the incision was bothering him. He looked at the chart. He looked at the patient. He moved to the next room. If he'd been a surgeon performing actual surgery, his approach might have made sense. But he was managing a post-operative patient, and post-operative care required attention. Attention required presence. Presence required something Dr. Pierce apparently didn't have. She was still thinking about the medication discrepancy when she walked into the break room at 8:02 a.m., her lunch bag in hand, her badge clipped to her pocket. The room held 7 other nurses, all of them with their lunches already unwrapped, sandwiches and salads and the sad Tupperware containers that hospital workers carried like talismans of a normal life they'd abandoned the moment they took the job. The room was warm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. And the moment Katie sat down in the plastic chair at the far end of the table, the exodus began. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just practiced. Efficient. A master class in social rejection. The woman to her left gathered her container of Greek yogurt and stood without making eye contact. The 2 nurses across from her finished their conversations mid-sentence and left as one. The nurse in the corner reading People magazine folded it slowly and walked out. Within 90 seconds, Katie was alone in the break room. Within 2 minutes, she was eating her sandwich in silence, listening to the fluorescent lights hum their judgment. She'd been in combat zones with more warmth. She'd been in supply tents during sandstorms with better morale. But this was the civilian world, and the civilian world had its own kind of hostility. Less obvious. More effective. She chewed her sandwich methodically, her jaw steady, her hands not shaking. The trembling wasn't fear. It never was. The trembling would have been something else, something with a military name. Restraint. Control. The knowledge that you could do something terrible and the choice to do it anyway was the only thing that made you human instead of animal. Katie finished eating at 8:24 a.m. and returned her container to her lunch bag. She rinsed her hands in the break room sink, watching the soap foam against her palms. The scars on her forearms caught the light from the window, rope burn from a training exercise in 2012, shrapnel burn from an IED in 2015, the kind of marks that told stories to anyone who knew how to read them. Dr. Pierce wasn't the type who read stories in skin. He read them in the hospital administration newsletters and financial reports. The morning continued in the rhythm that all hospital mornings follow. Vital signs. Medication administration. Chart reviews. Katie moved through her patients with the surgical precision that had kept her alive in places where hospitals were concrete rubble and tourniquets came from bedsheet strips. But it was her notation about the medication discrepancy that stayed with her. By 11:27 a.m., she'd verified the issue with pharmacy. The medication had been dispensed. It had been signed for. It had simply never been documented as given. Either Dr. Pierce had forgotten to chart it, or something else was happening. Something with numbers that didn't add up. She made another note. This time she would need to ask him directly. And that was when the real danger would begin. Because what Katie didn't know yet was that Dr. Pierce had built something beautiful in his negligence. Something worth protecting. Something worth destroying her to keep hidden. And he would. He absolutely would. That afternoon, when Katie retrieved the flag from her locker again, just to feel its weight, just to remember why she was staying, she traced the stars one more time. Major Chen was alive. Major Chen would leave Seattle General in 7 days and return to whatever mission had brought him here in the first place. And she would remain invisible. Meticulous. A quiet nurse keeping her head down. It was the best way to survive. It was the only way she'd learned. She didn't know that everything was about to change. She didn't know that the man in room for 12 was here for the same reason she was. She didn't know that her 3 months of invisibility were about to end in the next 72 hours. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. The hospital breathed around her. The room went dead silent when she closed her locker door. And somewhere below, on the administrative floor, Dr. Pierce was reviewing his financial accounts, unaware that a nurse had just started paying attention. And paying attention, in Katie's experience, was the most dangerous thing any of them could do. Dr. Pierce waited until Mrs. Henderson was mid-sentence, her weathered hands clutching the discharge papers Katie had just reviewed. Room 318 smelled of antiseptic and flowers. The Henderson son had received cardiac surgery 72 hours prior, and Katie was walking them through the post-operative narcotic schedule, explaining why their son needed to transition to over-the-counter pain management by day 5. The incision site will feel tender for another week, Katie said, her voice steady and low. You'll notice some bruising around the sternum. That's normal. If there's any drainage that's yellow or green, or if his temperature spikes above 101, you call us immediately. Not your primary care physician. Us. Dr. Pierce pushed through the door like he owned it. He was tall, expensively groomed, the kind of man whose shoes probably cost more than Katie's monthly car payment. His voice filled the room with the casual authority of someone who'd never been questioned in his life. Mrs. Henderson, I apologize that you're receiving instruction from someone barely competent to empty bedpans. The words landed like a slap. Mr. Henderson's face went rigid. His wife's grip tightened on the discharge papers. Pierce continued, his voice projecting into the hallway where nurses and residents were passing. Rodriguez, the nursing staff handles patient education, not whatever you are. I'll send someone qualified. Katie's jaw tightened. Her hands, which had steadied through convoy ambushes in Tikrit, remained completely motionless at her sides. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She turned and walked past Pierce with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. His voice followed her into the corridor, continuing to disparage her credentials to the Hendersons, but she was already gone, already compartmentalizing the humiliation into the same mental lockbox where she kept everything else she couldn't afford to feel. The break room the next morning was a stage set for practiced rejection. 6 veteran nurses sat at the main table, the territory every new staff member learns to avoid. Katie pushed through with her lunch bag, a deliberate choice, a refusal to eat at her desk like some quarantine thing. She sat down at the edge of the table. The exodus was immediate and choreographed. Sandra gathered her coffee. Maria scooped her yogurt. 3 others followed without eye contact, moving to the far corner like a school of fish recognizing a shark. The silence was the kind you could operate in. Katie unwrapped her sandwich, turkey, no mayo, nothing that would stain her scrubs, and ate alone while the other nurses' laughter filtered across the room in a carefully pitched volume that excluded her. She finished her lunch in 12 minutes, rinsed her container, and returned to the floor. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She'd learned long ago that trembling was a luxury reserved for people who could afford to break. That afternoon, Dr. Pierce posted his masterpiece on the unit board in the main hallway where every staff member would see it. The notice was laminated, official, typed on hospital letterhead with his signature in blue ink. Disciplinary action notice. Employee, Katie Rodriguez, RN. Date, today. Violations, insubordination and clinical incompetence. Details, unauthorized questioning of physician orders. Disruptive behavior affecting patient care and physician-nurse relations. Failure to respect chain of command. Unsuitable bedside manner. Status, probationary review in 30 days. Signature, Dr. Nathan Pierce, MD, Chief of Cardiac Surgery. Nurses walking past it averted their eyes. A third-year resident read it and smirked. Pierce stood nearby, arms crossed, waiting for her reaction like a hunter watching a trap. When Katie came down the hallway 20 minutes later, he made sure to position himself where she couldn't miss the notice. She read every word. Slowly. Each line a small burn. Then she turned to face him, and something shifted in her expression like a door opening onto a room no one was supposed to see. Her voice came out quiet. Surgical. Each word perfectly articulated. I've seen braver men than you bleed out begging for morphine. At least they had the courage to face what they'd become. She walked past him before he could respond, while he was still processing the words, while his face was still flushing red. His mouth opened. Closed. He tried to form a response, but she was already gone, already moving through the unit with that same controlled stillness, already erasing him from her focus the way you learn to erase things that don't matter. What Pierce didn't know, what he could never know from looking at her meticulous charting and her quiet competence, was that Katie wasn't just a nurse noticing discrepancies. She was a captain in naval intelligence, 3 months into an operation that was only now revealing its scope. Her medication logs weren't bureaucratic diligence. They were evidence. The post-surgical narcotic orders didn't match the supply usage. Surgical components marked as implanted weren't appearing in operative reports. A $200,000 annual patent that Pierce had been running for 18 months through a shell company registered to his wife's maiden name. Medicare billing codes inflated by 40%. Veterans Affairs contracts padded with phantom procedures that never happened, supplies that never existed, equipment that existed only in his imagination and his bank account. Pierce had made one critical mistake. He hadn't realized that the quiet nurse asking questions about medication discrepancies was actually a combat veteran who'd spent 2 years running supply chain investigations for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. He didn't know that Major David Chen in room 412, the cardiac surgery patient who'd spent 2 days post-op in controlled recovery, was a Special Forces officer running the parallel investigation from the military procurement side, tracing weapons-grade equipment and medical supplies that disappeared from Norfolk Naval Station and reappeared in Pierce's distribution network. Katie had been placed at Seattle General 3 months ago with one mission: gather evidence quietly, document the fraud, and maintain her cover until the military investigation reached critical mass. The operation was supposed to take 6 months. Clean. Invisible. Nobody gets burned. But then a cardiac patient crashed during a routine post-op assessment, and surgical incision rupturing from an undetected infection meant Katie couldn't wait for the code team. That wasn't the plan. That wasn't supposed to happen. And when she recognized the name on the chart, Major David Chen, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the man who'd handed her the folded American flag from her teammate's casket 2 years ago in Fallujah, everything shifted. That flag was in her locker. She'd carried it through 2 years of civilian life, 2 years of pretending to be just another nurse, 2 years of letting Dr. Pierce humiliate her without response. She kept it in the top drawer under her spare scrubs, a talisman and a reminder of the cost of secrets. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 hours after Pierce posted the disciplinary notice, Katie's phone rang while she was charting in the medication room. Unknown number. Her stomach dropped before she even answered. Hospital investigations moved fast, but this fast meant something else had happened. It was HR. They needed to speak with her immediately. Preliminary interview regarding her credentials and clinical judgment. An outside investigator had been brought in. Her previous employers were being contacted. There would be a 30-day review period, possibly a suspension pending the outcome of the investigation. Katie drove home that evening in heavy rain, the kind that hammered the windshield like applause for something she didn't understand. She sat in her car in the parking lot outside her apartment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing. If she was suspended, the investigation collapsed. Chen was vulnerable, still recovering from surgery in a hospital where Dr. Pierce controlled the charts and the medication orders. The supply chain stayed dirty. The money kept moving through the Veterans Affairs contracts and the Medicare billing codes. She pulled out her phone and texted the number she'd memorized 3 months ago. One word: compromised. The response came 30 seconds later: stand by. She sat in her car while rain hammered the roof and tried to remember what it felt like to breathe normally. Tomorrow, Dr. Pierce would escalate. He would call the board president. He would manufacture evidence. He would do what competent people do when they feel threatened. He would fight with everything he had, using every connection and every favor he'd ever collected. And Katie would sit in her apartment with her hands completely steady and wait for the Pentagon to decide whether her cover was worth burning. But right now, in the silence of her car, with the flag sitting in her locker 40 feet away and the weight of 2 simultaneous operations pressing down on her shoulders, she let herself think about Tikrit and the man lying in room for 12 and the impossible choice between revealing herself and watching her commanding officer die. Katie's fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone who documented casualty reports in convoy wreckage. 3 months at Seattle General, and her charting had become the kind of meticulous that made billing departments nervous. She logged vitals. She logged medication times. She logged the discrepancies that didn't add up. Room for 12. Major Chen. Post-op day 9. The numbers didn't lie. She'd been watching the post-operative narcotic orders since his surgery, morphine dispensed at 0400, 0800, 1200, 1600, 2000. Standard protocol for his incision class and pain level. But the pharmacy records showed larger quantities pulled than Chen's actual consumption. The difference was small enough to miss if you weren't looking. Katie was always looking. She cross-referenced the surgical supply logs. Sutures ordered in quantities that exceeded the surgical schedule. Implantable mesh counted on the inventory sheet but never appearing in actual operative reports. The pattern was clean. Methodical. The kind of scheme that worked because it relied on the assumption that nurses didn't have time to think, only to execute. But Katie had time. Katie had battlefield experience sorting signal from noise under fire, and this was noise with a financial motive. The audit trail was forming in real time. A tether between Dr. Pierce and something that looked increasingly like fraud. She saved her documentation. Closed the screen. Checked room 412 again at 0530. Major Chen was awake, studying her face with the flat assessment of someone trained to read situations in hostile territory. She maintained professional distance, entered his vitals into the system, and left without speaking. The flag in her locker felt heavier each day. The weight of dual missions. The weight of knowing who he was and what he was doing here. The weight of knowing what Pierce was doing too. By noon on day 12, Dr. Pierce had noticed. He didn't confront her directly. That wasn't his style anymore. He was moving into the next phase, the strategic phase, where competent villains weaponized policy. Katie arrived at 0700 to find a memo on the unit board, her name highlighted in yellow. Effective immediately, staff reassignment. Katie Rodriguez transferred to pediatric care. All post-surgical oversight responsibility removed. All access to pharmacy reconciliation reports restricted pending administrative review. The message was surgical in its precision: you are being removed from the equation. Pierce passed her in the hallway at 0845, walking with 2 colleagues from administration, his tailored suit the color of money and his expression the kind of confidence that came from knowing he had institutional allies. He didn't look at her. That was intentional too. Invisibility was worse than humiliation. It was erasure. Katie changed her assignment without argument. She worked pediatric intake for 3 hours, vitals, intake assessments, discharge summaries. The work was competent and empty. Her mind was in room 412, where another nurse was making Chen's rounds now. A nurse who wouldn't recognize the subtle signs. A nurse who wouldn't see what was building. She was thinking about this at 11:45 when her phone buzzed with a text from an encrypted app. One word: fever. At 1400, she walked past room 412 on her way to the storage closet. Couldn't stop. Just walked past. Through the small window, she saw Chen's chart on the bed table, could read temp 103.4 from the hallway without opening the door. His respiratory rate was audible from outside, faster than it should be. The way his chest moved suggested effort, not rest. The way his eyes tracked her walking past suggested he understood the situation perfectly. 7 years of Special Forces training had taught Major Chen to read deterioration in the human body the way other people read expressions. He knew his own incision was infected. He knew the sepsis was starting. He knew Katie couldn't help him without destroying both their covers. She kept walking. At 12:30, Pierce had paged the ward nurse covering Chen's care. "Post-op fever is normal. Stop bothering me with nursing anxieties." His voice came through the intercom, sharp and dismissive. Katie heard it from pediatrics. Heard the resignation in the covering nurse's response. "Understood, Dr. Pierce. I'll continue routine monitoring." Routine monitoring wouldn't catch sepsis before it turned septic. Routine monitoring was how soldiers died in field hospitals, not from the wound itself, but from what came after. From the infection that moved like an intelligent operation, systematic and patient. At 1400, Katie was in the pediatric supply closet when her department phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She almost didn't answer. Nurse Rodriguez. A male voice. Calm. Military cadence. "This is Captain James Halloway, U.S. Army Medical Command. We're conducting a supply chain audit on behalf of the Pentagon's Procurement Division. Specifically regarding materials and medications routed through Seattle General over the past 6 months. Your name has appeared in several documentation flags we're investigating. Are you available for a brief interview?" The words hit like shrapnel. The audit. The official audit. Someone at CENTCOM or JSOC had noticed the same pattern Katie had noticed. Someone with federal authority and federal resources had been tracking the same discrepancies. "I'm available," she said quietly. "Excellent. We'll be in Seattle on Friday. 3 days. We're keeping this confidential from hospital administration until the initial investigation is complete. Can we count on your discretion?" "Of course." "Good. Major Chen sends his regards. He mentioned you were the kind of asset who thinks like a soldier, not a nurse." He was correct. The line went dead. Katie stood in the supply closet with her hand steady and her heart moving at a rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion. The Pentagon knew. A captain from Army Medical Command knew. The operation was escalating toward exposure, which meant the timeline had compressed. Friday. 3 days. Before then, Chen had to survive. Before then, Pierce had to make his move. And before then, Katie had to choose between being invisible and being insubordinate. She left the supply closet at 14:30 and walked directly to room 412. The covering nurse was at the station. Katie had approximately 90 seconds. She opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. The antiseptic smell hit first, then the sound of the oxygen concentrator running a thin hiss beneath the monitors. Chen's eyes opened. Temperature of 103.4. Respiratory rate of 28. The incision line was flushed red, the skin around it hot enough to feel through gloved hands. "Your temp is climbing," she said quietly. 12 hours, maximum. "He won't order cultures." Chen's voice was barely audible. Told the other nurse it was normal. "It's not." She checked the foresight. Looked at his labs. Blood glucose elevated. White count climbing. All the markers of a body fighting something it was losing against. Her hands moved across his chart with the muscle memory of a trauma surgeon who'd run field assessments in convoy wreckage, reading vital signs like classified documents. The prognosis was clear. The timeline was clear. By tomorrow morning, Chen would be in septic shock. She was still standing there when she heard the footsteps in the hallway. Rodriguez. Out. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway, his face the color of someone who understood that his careful system was fracturing. He'd seen her enter the room. He'd timed her entry. He'd made a decision. "Room for 12 is not your assignment," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You have violated your restricted access. You have demonstrated continued insubordination after explicit reassignment. I'm documenting this as grounds for immediate termination. You will leave this hospital at 1,500 hours. Your badge will be deactivated. Your access will be revoked. You will not return to this floor. You will not contact this patient or any patient under my care. Am I understood? Katie looked at him with the flat, arctic stare of someone who'd negotiated with worse than administrative bullies. She looked at him with the eyes of a captain who'd seen men die from exactly this kind of systemic failure, from decisions made by people more interested in protecting their reputation than protecting lives. I understand, she said. She walked past him into the hallway. Kept walking. She could feel Pierce's presence behind her like a weapon, but she didn't turn around. The power was moving. The game was shifting. 3 days until the Pentagon arrived. 1 day until Chen crashed. 8 hours until her shift ended and she became officially terminated. She touched the flag through her locker door as she changed out of her scrubs. The weight of it was constant now, like a scar that had learned to speak. Marcus was at after-school care. Her apartment was waiting. Her phone was already warming with messages from Captain Holloway's team, asking about timing, about access, about the specific discrepancies she'd found. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the email in her inbox, sent by Dr. Pierce at 1,442 hours. Subject line, termination of employment, effective immediately. She was reading it when the overhead intercom crackled, code blue, room for 12. Code blue. The monitors were screaming in a frequency she could hear even from the parking lot. She stopped walking. Turned around. Dr. Pierce was rushing past the nurse's station, his face the color of someone who'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Katie stood at the exit with her badge in her hand and her son waiting in after-school care and the entire operation about to detonate in 3 days. She could leave. She could walk out. She could protect her cover. She could also watch Major David Chen, the man who'd handed her the flag from her teammate's casket, the man who'd trained her, the man who understood what she was willing to sacrifice, die because she'd chosen obedience over action. She turned around and ran toward room 412, her badge deactivation time still 90 seconds away from processing. The doors opened like she'd never left. Day 12. That's all it took. Katie pushed through the double doors of the 4th floor at 0557, her badge still clipped to her scrubs, still showing her clearance. 48 minutes until shift change. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and rain from the storm that had hammered Norfolk all night, leaving everything damp and electric. Room for 12 was at the far end, past the nurse's station where 3 RNS were charting, past the supply closet where yesterday someone had whispered her name like a curse. She didn't look at them. The vitals monitor outside Major Chen's room showed what she already knew would be there. Temperature 101.8. Up from 99.2 the day before. Not much. But enough. Enough that Katie's hands moved on their own, pulling the door open, stepping into the semi-darkness where Chen slept with his left side wrapped in sterile gauze, where his surgical incision marked the place where Dr. Pierce's team had installed a reconstruction graft 36 hours after the IED blast had torn through his abdomen. She didn't touch him yet. Just looked. The redness was visible even in the grey morning light bleeding through the window. It spread from the incision site like watercolor bleeding into cotton, warm and angry, the skin surrounding the bandage swollen with the particular shine of edema. Infection. Not pneumonia, not UTI, not the 1,000 minor complications that hospitals tracked and treated and logged. This was surgical site infection. This was catastrophic. Katie had seen enough of it. She'd performed emergency thoracotomies in convoy wreckage under fire, had held human organs in her hands while rounds whistled overhead, had the kind of medical education you only got when your classroom was a burning vehicle and your patients were bleeding out faster than you could think. She knew infection. She knew what it looked like when the body turned on itself. She palpated the area around the incision. Warm. Too warm. The tissue around the graft was firm, resistant, the way flesh got when bacteria were metabolizing it from the inside. She could feel the heat through the bandage, a fever signature written in tissue temperature. Katie reached for the call light. Her finger was on the button when Chen's eyes opened. "Mama." His voice was thick, confused. Delirium already. The fever was higher than the monitor showed. Sepsis was already moving through him like a second IED, this one invisible, this one systematic. "Mama, the light's too bright." "I'm here, Major." She kept her voice level. "Steady. The way you spoke to soldiers in shock. Don't move. I'm getting the team." She reached for the call light again. That's when his chest collapsed. It wasn't subtle. There was no time for subtle. His right lung simply stopped existing. The pressure inside his thoracic cavity, the pneumothorax building from the undetected infection eating through tissue planes, creating an air pocket that expanded with every breath, reached critical mass and his rib cage folded inward like someone had punched his chest from the inside. His oxygen saturation dropped like a stone. The monitor screamed. Code blue. Katie's hands moved. Not decision, not thought. Muscle memory. The kind of reflexive competence that only came from surviving. She slammed the code button. Once. Hard. The hospital would respond. The surgical team would respond. But they would take 90 seconds. Maybe 120. Major David Chen's heart would stop before then. She was already moving. The crash cart was outside room 412, silver and angular, stocked with every tool of violent resuscitation. Katie yanked open the drawers. Scalpel. 14-gauge needle. Chest tube. Her hand sorted them the way a pilot's hand sorted instruments in a cockpit during an emergency landing, not searching, recognizing, selecting. The stunned nurse at the station, young, maybe a year out of school, appeared in the doorway. "I'll get Dr. Pierce. Get me an RN and a blood pump. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command, pitched in a frequency of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The nurse's expression shifted. She disappeared. Katie was already opening Chen's gown. His chest was pale, his lips turning blue, the color of someone whose blood was beginning to thicken from lack of oxygen. The veins in his neck were distended like ropes. His breath came in gasping pulls that did nothing. The pneumothorax was total. She found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Her finger located the rib. The space between. She held the scalpel like she'd held 1,000 medical instruments before, but also like she'd held a combat knife in a casualty collection point while a Marine screamed, while rounds impacted the sandbags above her position, while she decided in 1.7 seconds whether to spend blood units on a salvageable case or move to the next soldier. The blade went in. Air hissed out. Not a sound. A physical thing. The pneumothorax depressurizing, the pressure differential finally equalizing, and with it, the space around Chen's heart suddenly finding room to exist again. His oxygen saturation was already climbing. 94, 96. 98. Katie inserted the chest tube. 28 French. Secured it. Taped it. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this in combat, which meant in darkness, which meant with her fingers reading anatomy like Braille, which meant with no margin for error because the margin for error was a man's death and she'd already experienced that once and wouldn't again. 90 seconds. Chen's eyes fluttered open. Blue, aware, locking onto her face from 3 inches away. His cracked lips moved. Valkyrie. The nickname from Tikrit. The code name from the operation. The name they'd called her when she'd led the trauma team through the burning checkpoint, when she'd triaged 12 soldiers in the time it took a medevac bird to rotate toward their position, when she'd done things that the human body shouldn't survive and soldiers had anyway. Katie's face went white. Every person on the 4th floor had crowded toward the glass wall of room 412. The resident stared. The attending physician stood motionless. The nurses had abandoned their stations. The entire hospital floor was watching through the transparent panels as the quiet new nurse performed emergency surgery with her bare hands and the sure movements of someone who'd done battlefield medicine in convoy wreckage, who'd saved lives when the only option was operating on the side of the road while hostile fire bracketed your position. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway. His expression was triumphant. He'd seen. He understood. She'd just revealed herself. She'd just blown her cover saving the man she was sent to protect, and now there was no deniability, no way to claim she was just a competent nurse responding to a code. She'd used precision that transcended training. She'd used authority that transcended rank. She'd used knowledge that had no civilian source. He already had his phone in his hand. Katie didn't watch him dial. She was focused on Chen's breathing, on the steady hiss of the chest tube, on the O2 saturation holding at 99 now, on the heart rhythm settling into something almost normal. The crisis was resolved. The immediate death was prevented. The cascade of cascade events that would follow was already beginning. Security arrived 93 minutes later. Katie was still in room for 12, still in her scrubs, still holding Chen's pulse to verify the radial artery pressure was coming back into the normal range. The administrator, a woman named Rodriguez, no relation, the universe's sense of irony apparently intact, stood in the doorway with a younger man in a blue polo shirt with a radio clipped to his belt. "Your badge is deactivated," the administrator said quietly. "As of 0603. Effective immediately." Katie didn't look away from Chen. His eyes were closed again, his breathing steady. The infection had tried to kill him. The pneumothorax had tried to kill him. The system had tried to silence her, and she'd let it, right up until silence meant a man died. "I understand," she said. The security guard escorted her to the locker room. Her uniform came off like shedding a skin. The scrubs went into the laundry. She opened the small metal door of her locker and found the folded flag, pressed into the space between her shift rotation notes and a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen. The flag was from her teammate. From Sergeant William Flores, who died at Tikrit on a Tuesday. Who'd been brought to the triage area with wounds too severe even for her hands that had learned to move faster than panic. Major Chen had handed her that flag at the memorial service, pressed it into her hands with both of his, and said, "He served with honor. You carry it forward." That flag had moved with Katie to Norfolk. That flag had lived in her locker, a talisman, a reminder, a physical anchor to the identity she'd been forced to leave behind. She held it against her chest and walked to her car. The rain had stopped, but the parking lot was still slick, still smelled like ozone and wet concrete and the particular emptiness of early morning when most of the world was still sleeping. Katie sat in the driver's seat with the door open, the flag folded across her lap, and didn't start the engine. 8-year-old Marcus found her at the kitchen table at 1900, silent tears streaming down her face as she clutched her phone. She'd been sitting there for almost 8 hours, the flag folded on the table beside her, the phone in her hands showing the message from the Pentagon investigator, Stand by. Operation status changing. "Mommy." Marcus's voice was small, uncertain. He'd learned to recognize the difference between the mother who was home from work and the mother who came home from war, even if war had just happened quietly in a hospital on the 4th floor. "Why are you home early?" Katie couldn't answer. She reached out and pulled him into her arms while he wrapped his small body around her, still in his school uniform, still carrying the weight of the afternoon. She couldn't explain that Major Chen, the man who had commanded his father's unit, who had handed them the folded flag, who had become the closest thing to a father Marcus had since Iraq took the original, might die because she'd saved him too publicly. Might die because she'd been forced to choose between her cover and his life, and she'd chosen his life, and now the operation was compromised and everything she'd sacrificed to protect was collapsing. The phone rang at 2200. A Marine colonel's voice, crisp and formal, "Captain Rodriguez? This is Colonel James Halloway with Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I need you to return to Seattle General immediately. We have medical clearance and you're going to want to see what's happening in room for 12. Katie's tears stopped. Her hand steadied. The transformation began. 3 hours after her termination, she was walking back through the doors of Seattle General with the Marine colonel beside her, both of them moving with the precise coordination of military personnel, both of them carrying the weight of secrets being exposed to light. Major Chen's eyes fluttered open as she entered room 412. Stable. The infection fighting with antibiotics. The pneumothorax sealed. The crisis prevented. His eyes locked on hers, and his cracked lips formed a single word: Valkyrie. Grim-faced hospital administrators surrounded the room. A Navy captain in dress uniform stood near the window. Behind him, the figure of a 2-star general waited in the hallway, his uniform crisp, his bearing absolute. The Marine colonel opened a leather folder. Captain Katie Rodriguez, United States Army Nurse Corps. The words landed like rounds into a target. The hospital administrators exchanged glances. Dr. Pierce had arrived, standing at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed. His expression began to shift. 7th Combat Support Hospital, Tikrit, Iraq, 2019 through 2021. The Navy captain stepped forward. Captain Rodriguez received the Silver Star for actions on November 12, 2020, conducted under heavy enemy fire. Pierce's arms dropped to his sides. Under enemy fire, Captain Rodriguez extracted 12 wounded soldiers from a burning convoy, performing emergency thoracotomies in the field while mortar rounds impacted within 50 meters of her position. The hallway had gone completely silent. Nurses had stopped charting. Residents had abandoned rounds. The entire 4th floor understood, in that moment, that they had been watching a legend move through their halls and had mistaken her for a trainee. The 2-star general stepped into the room. His shoes clicked on the tile like a gavel. Every person in the hallway snapped to attention except Pierce, who still didn't know he should. The general faced Katie and saluted. Hand to forehead. The gesture of respect flowing from higher rank to lower. The gesture of honor. Captain, the men and women you saved that day are alive because you led the finest combat trauma team I've ever seen. Katie's eyes were wet but her posture was steel. The transformation was complete. The general turned to Chen. Major Chen has confirmed that Captain Rodriguez was conducting a joint operation investigating procurement fraud. Her nursing assignment was classified cover. The 2-star addressed the assembled hospital staff, his voice carrying the frequency of command. What you witnessed this morning was a combat trauma specialist saving a soldier's life. What Dr. Pierce has attempted to destroy is the operation that was tracking his illegal activity. Pierce tried to speak. His voice cracked. There are protocols, proper channels, you can't just. A Pentagon investigator in a dark suit stepped into the hallway, flanked by 2 federal marshals wearing the particular stillness of people trained to move fast. The investigator was already reading from a tablet, already building the case that would demolish everything Pierce had constructed. Dr. Pierce, we've been monitoring your communications. We need to discuss your supply orders, your billing practices, and your contact with the hospital board president at 1713 this morning. The investigator nodded to Katie. Valkyrie was the operation code name. Captain Rodriguez's documentation gave us everything. Every discrepancy. Every falsified procedure. Every phantom order traced back to your network. Chen's voice came from the bed, weak but clear. She saved my life twice. Once in Tikrit when my convoy hit an IED. Once today when my body tried to kill me. The hallway went silent except for the heart monitor's beep. One pulse. Then another. A rhythm restored. The badge hung in Katie's locker like a severed artery. Dr. Pierce had walked into the nurse's station at 14:02, 15 minutes after Major Chen's rhythm stabilized, his face the color of wet concrete. You're done, he'd said. Not fired. Done. Like she was a procedure cancelled, not a person. The hospital administrator stood behind him, nervous fingers adjusting his glasses, apologetic eyes that wouldn't meet hers. We need to protect the institution, the administrator said. Your actions today, while they saved a life, violated protocol. Dr. Pierce has documented your insubordination, and until an outside investigator clears your credentials, which, frankly, may take weeks, we cannot in good conscience allow you access to patient care." Katie listened without moving. She didn't ask questions. She didn't defend herself. She simply removed her badge, the laminate still warm from her uniform, and placed it on the desk with the precision of someone setting down surgical instruments. The click of it landing on metal echoed across the station. By 15:03, her locker was empty. By 15:53, she was in her car, hand steady on the wheel, driving through the rain toward home. Marcus was at aftercare until 17:30. Katie had 97 minutes. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone in front of her, screen dark, because looking at it meant thinking about what had just happened, and thinking meant the composure would crack. The rain hammered the windows like shrapnel. The house was too quiet. She'd chosen this small, ordinary house on Maple Street, this quiet job, this temporary identity as just another nurse trying to move up in the hospital world. Temporary had become 3 months. 3 months of her son asking why she came home so tired, why she had nightmares, why there was a flag in her locker that she wouldn't explain. It belonged to a friend, she'd said. Marcus had asked if the friend was okay. Katie hadn't answered. The rain intensified. She pressed her palm against the cold window and felt the old scar tissue there, the map of Tikrit written in her skin. Chen was alive. That was the mission. That was always the mission. But the operation was dead. Blown. Exposed. Pentagon audit teams would have to establish a new investigator, rebuild protocols, find another entry point into Pierce's supply chain. Weeks of work, compromised in 90 seconds because she'd grabbed a scalpel and saved a man's life. At 17:12, her phone lit up. Not a call. A notification. Then another. Then a cascade, texts, emails, app alerts. Someone had posted video. She opened TikTok with trembling fingers, which wasn't fear, wasn't doubt, it was the trembling of restraint finally cracking against the weight it had carried. The video was from 1356. Room 318. The Hendersons standing by their daughter's bedside, expressions caught between hope and exhaustion. And Dr. Pierce's voice, clear and cutting as a scalpel through silk, "Your daughter is fortunate to be in this hospital. Unfortunately, she's been under the care of a nurse barely competent to empty bedpans, let alone manage post-operative cardiovascular assessment." The Hendersons' faces. The mother's hand to her mouth. Katie could see her own back in the frame, turning to leave, and she could see the moment Pierce's eye settled on her spine, satisfied that he'd landed the blow exactly where he intended. The video had been viewed 612 times. Shared 89 times. Comments were multiplying like infection. Former patients. Colleagues. Someone with the username at @drgallocardiac had written, "I taught you to heal, not to destroy. I taught you that a physician's power is measured in lives saved, not egos fed. I don't know this man. I don't recognize what he's become." Dr. Raymond Gallo. Katie had found references to him in Pierce's office, wedding photos, recruitment letters, the infrastructure of his entire professional legitimacy. And Gallo had just severed it in 2 sentences. At 22:30, Dr. Pierce was still in the hallway outside the nurse's station, his phone vibrating against his thigh like a second heartbeat. The board president, who'd been benignly golfing this afternoon, had sent a message at 20:48, "We need to talk. Immediately." 3 major donors had withdrawn funding pledges. The hospital's reputation committee was assembling. An ethics review board was being convened. By 23:40, Pierce's wife had called, her voice hollow. "Raymond Gallo was on the news. He was your mentor. He said you betrayed everything he taught you. What happened, Michael? What did you do?" Pierce had tried to explain protocol violation, insubordination, the importance of maintaining hierarchies that prevented chaos in medical environments. His wife had gone very quiet. "Michael, I watched the video. That was bullying. That wasn't medicine. That was someone with a title punishing someone without one. He'd hung up. The phone rang again. And again. At 034, federal investigators had called requesting all documentation of his supply chain procurement. At 1:33, the outside investigator he'd summoned had received a subpoena. By morning, everything Pierce had constructed, the shell companies, the phantom billing, the network of hospital board allies and insurance contacts, was visible to everyone with a federal warrant and a reason to look. Katie's phone rang at 1:33. Unknown number. She answered because when you've been trained to respond to radio calls in Tikrit, you answer every call. Captain Rodriguez, this is Commander Sarah Khalil, Joint Medical Oversight, Pentagon Procurement Division. Major Chen has regained consciousness and requested your immediate return to Seattle General. There is a situation developing that requires your presence. Katie's voice came out even, level, the voice of someone who'd reported casualties to generals. I was terminated 3 hours ago. My badge is deactivated. I'm aware, Khalil said. Your termination will be reversed. Your badge will be reactivated. You are being reinstated as nursing lead for the Chen recovery protocol. Can you be at the hospital in 40 minutes? Katie was already moving, already reaching for her uniform jacket, the one with the Silver Star citation she'd hidden in the lining. Yes. One more thing, Captain. Dr. Pierce attempted to interrupt the federal investigation 3 times in the last 2 hours with claims about protocols and proper channels. The investigator informed him that proper channels are now classified, that he is the subject of a fraud investigation, and that any further communication attempts will be interpreted as obstruction. He's in his car right now. Alone. Probably driving home to pack a bag. Katie could imagine Pierce's hands on the steering wheel, the dawning comprehension that this had moved beyond a human resources problem, that he'd attracted attention from above the hospital's authority level, that every choice he'd made to consolidate power had actually been building a bridge for federal prosecutors. She could imagine the moment he understood that Katie Rodriguez had never been a threat to his supply chain alone. She was the entire operation. Thank you, Commander Khalil. I'll be there in 38 minutes. At 1:35, Katie left a note on the kitchen table for Marcus, arranged for an emergency sitter, and walked out into the rain with her uniform in a duffel bag and her Silver Star still hidden in the lining. By 6 o'clock the next morning, federal marshals arrived at Dr. Pierce's home with a warrant. By 8 o'clock, the hospital board had begun reviewing 7 years of billing records. By 10 o'clock, 2 nurses and a coding specialist had been interviewed. They'd been forced to participate in the supply chain fraud or face retaliation in the form of shift reassignments, denied promotions, exclusion from the break room's protective social circle. One of them cried during her statement. One of them said she'd wanted to report it but was afraid. One of them said she'd believed Pierce had connections to the hospital board that made him untouchable. All of them were wrong. By 12 o'clock, the hospital's external counsel had opened a civil settlement process for families who'd been overcharged. By 4 p.m., the medical board convened an emergency hearing. By the end of the week, Pierce's medical license was revoked. The hearing record showed that he'd billed for procedures that never occurred, ordered supplies that were never opened, and created a system where accountability flowed only downward, where nurses were blamed for shortages he'd created, where excellence was measured by compliance rather than outcomes. The only job Pierce could find afterward was teaching CPR certification courses at Norfolk Community College for $15 an hour, 3 nights a week, in a building Katie had walked through during her own EMT refresher training 7 years earlier. He would never know that she recognized the irony. He would never know that the woman he'd called barely competent to empty bedpans had been the one holding $17 million in corruption in her meticulous charting. He would never know what he'd tried to destroy. 2 weeks later, Katie returned to Seattle General in her Navy nurse uniform, her captain's bars polished to a shine that reflected the overhead lights, the Silver Star ribbon on her chest the color of fresh blood. Marcus was beside her, his hand in hers, and he was wearing his father's dog tags, the ones his mother had taught him to understand as a promise kept even after death. They stopped at Major Chen's door. He was sitting up now, color in his face, the kind of recovery that comes from having a reason to survive. Katie placed the folded flag on his bedside table, the same flag he'd handed her 2 years ago at Arlington, the flag from her teammate's casket, the flag she'd kept in her locker through every shift, every humiliation, every moment that had led here. "You carried this from Tikrit to my husband's funeral," she said, and her voice was steady as surgical steel. "I've carried it every day since. It reminded me why the mission mattered." Chen reached for the flag with a hand that still trembled slightly, the kind of tremor that would fade in weeks. "Your charting broke everything. 17 million in fraudulent supplies. Medical shipments that were supposed to reach combat units but instead were billed as phantom procedures. Your meticulous documentation created an audit trail he couldn't erase." He looked at Marcus. "This is your son." "This is Marcus," Katie said. "He wants to understand what his father died protecting. Not just freedom. Accountability. The idea that no one is above the law, that a title doesn't grant immunity from consequences." Chen managed a weak salute, the kind of gesture that carries more weight than 1,000 words. Marcus stood very still, watching his mother with eyes that were finally beginning to understand, not the details, but the shape of it, the weight of it, the reason she'd carried that flag like a prayer. "Your mother saved my life twice," Chen said, his voice roughened by intubation but steady. "Once in Tikrit when my convoy hit an IED. She performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife while under fire. Once here when she refused to let protocol matter more than a patient." Marcus looked up at his mother like she was someone he'd never quite seen before. Katie's voice came gentle now, the way it came for her son. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything together. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?